I wanted to spend a little bit of time today discussing this book, The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo. Obviously, it's very well known in Ashram and Auroville. I'm less certain as to whether it's very well read in Ashram and Auroville. And the reason for that is fairly clear. It's a difficult book. It's profound and it's difficult, but yet people still persist with it. And the question is, why would they persist with it if it is so hard? And that's what I wanted to discuss today. It's a book that I first encountered as a teenager when I went to university. So I encountered it in my youth. And I still remember how I felt when I first picked it up. And in fact, very recently, I found an interview by Satprem, and he described how he approached the life divine when he encountered it. And I wanted to read just the 2 or 3 sentences from Satprem because they convey a little bit of what I felt and maybe a little bit of what many people feel when they encounter the life divine. And Satprem is describing the year in which he went traveling. He went around South America, he went around the Amazon, and it was his year of great seeking, I believe. And he said this when he was interviewed. He said, "I wandered around the world with the life divine. And whenever I read a page or two, it wasn't even the words I was looking at. I felt a sort of look or depth in the background. And I liked being in the company of that." So it wasn't even his philosophy, which I knew very little of, that really interested me. I like that quote, even though I've only just found it. It seems to resonate quite deeply with me because it describes how I felt when I first picked up the life divine as well. I happen to be maybe fortunate enough to pick up the life divine without the weight of knowing who Sri Aurobindo truly was. So I just picked up this dense-looking book, which I couldn't really understand. And as Satprem said, he felt a look or a depth in the background, and he said, "I liked being in the company of that." And I think that's how I felt too when I first picked it up. I didn't really understand that much of it, but I just kind of got the sense that whatever this was, whoever this author was, he knew what he was talking about. I liked being in the company of that. And maybe that's also an interesting and an apt description of Sri Aurobindo, because it's not "I liked being in the company of him." He seems too large to be described as a him. He's like a universal force. And he has been described in that way. So that was also my initial reaction, that there was a profundity there, which I couldn't quite understand. So as Satprem said, it wasn't even his philosophy. And I suspect, from what I can remember of my teenage years, that's how I felt about the life divine. It wasn't really the quality or the depth of the prose. There was just something there that led me to know that I needed to persist with this book. And that's really the start of my interaction with you today. I wanted to discuss this idea. Why do we persist with a book that's so difficult? Because everyone who has seriously attempted the life divine will at some point have that reaction. Why is it so hard? Well, firstly, maybe we need to say a few words about what the life divine actually is. It's Sri Aurobindo's major work of spiritual philosophy. In it, he grapples with the fundamental issues of life. All the major issues of philosophy are handled in the life divine. What is the nature of reality? Is it an illusion? Is it real? What is the purpose of human evolution? Why are we here? Why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? All of these questions that have occupied spiritual seekers throughout the ages are dealt with in this book. And its central effort is to reconcile spirit and matter, heaven and earth. There's not a dichotomy. There's never an unbroken line between where we are and where we wish to be. There's always a deep connection with everything that simply is. So what Sri Aurobindo is showing, and this is an image he uses in the Life Divine, and it's an image from the Bible, the idea that there's not really a fall from the divine. There's not a fall of man as such. What we are witnessing on the earth plane is a progressive manifestation of the divine. So that's the core idea of the Life Divine. That little by little, we are evolving towards something greater, whatever that greater might be. So there's a lot to take in. Already the scope of what he is doing is profound. It's fiercely ambitious. And you can see why it's intimidating for any reader that seeks to pick it up. So the first question that we can ask ourselves maybe is, how did this book actually come about? And it's slightly unusual, I think, for a book of philosophy to start its life in a magazine. But that is indeed how the Life Divine started. It started in a periodical called the Arya. The Arya was published between 1914 and 1921. Within it, the Life Divine appeared serially, and it appeared between August 1914 and January 1919. So the book, the chapters in relation to it were concluded then, but the Arya itself, which was a collection of a vast array of material, continued beyond that. So if it started in a magazine, if it was serialized in a magazine, which must have been an enormous undertaking for author and for reader to on a monthly basis grapple with such deep and heavy material. And he actually acknowledged this. Sri Aurobindo acknowledged that this was intense material that he was covering. So the magazine itself, the Arya, started off as a result of an early meetings that he had with both the mother and her husband of that time, Paul Richard. Paul Richard is a fascinating character in so many ways. He was a Frenchman, he was a French advocate, and he was an aspiring politician. He had an aspiring interest in the occult and in spirituality. And I think really that is the defining characteristic of Paul Richard. Yes, he was a politician. Yes, he was an advocate, but it seems to me as if his abiding interest was in trying to understand the deeper mysteries of life, whatever they might be and however he might have characterized them. We know that he came to India with a desire to meet a yogi. He wanted to find someone that could teach him something more. In one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo said that he came to India seeking a master, seeking a world teacher. There's a lot more we can say about Paul Richard. Obviously, the mother has said a lot more. But just in relation to the narrative, in relation to the Life Divine, I think that's the key elements we need to understand. That he was also a seeker of some description. He arrived in India also seeking for something. And he found it in some way in Sri Aurobindo. So he arrived with a desire to meet a yogi. And it's his immense good fortune, of course, that he met Sri Aurobindo. And it was their meeting in 1914 that the idea of starting a journal arose. Interestingly, the journal idea did not come from Sri Aurobindo, it came from Paul Richard. He's the one that suggested, shall we start a journal? Sri Aurobindo confirmed this in a letter that he wrote to one of his disciples, Dilip Kumar Roy. Dilip had asked him, obviously, how did this journal start? And Sri Aurobindo put it like this in a letter of 1934. he said, Richard proposed to me to cooperate in a philosophical review. And as my theory was that a yogi ought to be able to turn his hand to anything, I could not very well refuse. I had only to write down in the terms of the intellect all that I had observed and come to know in practicing yoga daily, and the philosophy was automatically there. There's quite a bit to unpack in that letter. I mean, I think we could firstly say he could refuse if he wanted to. He was Sri Aurobindo and it was his choice. But he obviously thought there was a good reason to persist with collaborating on a journal. But his point that a yogi ought to be able to turn his hand to anything is important. It's important in what we know of Sri Aurobindo's yoga, which is that there's nothing off limits. There's no high work and there's no low work. So I think in one of his letters probably, he specifically pointed to the work of a cobbler and said mending shoes is not low work and poetry is not high work necessarily. Both of them can be used as methods for advancement in your spiritual path. So to become a journalist, to become a monthly writer, there's nothing lesser in that task than in sitting in extreme silence. Now that's also interesting because there are other yogis who would say otherwise. I can think of one yogi from Tiruvannamalai, and this isn't Sri Ramana that I'm thinking of, who said exactly that once you have realized the self, you will realize that words are meaningless. You will realize that there's nothing more to be said. Well, that's the kind of demarcation that Sri Aurobindo rejected, that there isn't a world of activity and then a world of silence. And his approach to journalism or writing a work of philosophy reveals that to be the case. So that's the first thing about this letter that's interesting, this idea that Sri Aurobindo said, you should be able, if you're a yogi, to turn your mind to anything. The second thing he points out was how he wrote. He said, I only had to write down what I observed and came to know in practicing yoga daily. So this book is an act of seeing. It's an act of observation. It's not an act of cerebral work. He's not stopping down to work out his ideas. Do I think this? Is this logically an extension of the previous idea that I have had? That is what a philosopher would do. That is what an academic would do. It is not what Sri Aurobindo was doing. It was an act of seeing. So that's what he said to his disciple Dilip in 1934. As I said, the Arya stopped printing in 1921, perfectly coinciding almost with the outbreak of the First World War, its conclusion, and then the peace treaties that were put in place after that war. So it was surprising that in a time of great world bleakness, that this is what Sri Aurobindo had to say to the world, his message of hope. So after the Arya concluded, it was to be quite some time, not until 1939 in particular, that the formation of a book was really put forward. The idea that all the chapters that were in the Arya that made up the life divine should be extracted, revised, and ready for publication. So that was the relevant period, that it was written in the Arya during the circumstances of the First World War, and then it was ready for publication at the outbreak of the Second World War. There's a synergy there where a great yogi is giving a message of hope in times of great bleakness. When it was eventually published, there was a little bit of a lag, but eventually the book did find its way to England, and it was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement. That Sri Aurobindo should be reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement in the early 40s, I think it happened in 1942, the actual review's publication, is also quite astonishing in some ways, because here was an individual, a man who had given up political activity. He had retreated to his cave of Tapasya, I think he called Pondicherry, and he made it clear he wasn't a public figure anymore. But yet people still understood he had something profound to say. So when he read this into book form, they wanted to listen, and it was reviewed by the Times Literary Supplement. And it was reviewed by quite a respected author in his own right, by a man called Sir Francis' husband, Sir Francis' young husband, rather. And he reminds me a little bit of Mother's friend, the great Tibetan explorer, Alexandra David Neal. He's one of these Westerners who wanted to explore the East, who wanted to understand deeper mysteries. And maybe there's a question mark of the extent to which he actually understood what he was trying to understand. But there's something valiant in the endeavor, at least. We know that he developed his own spiritual philosophy of some kind, which is also interested in human evolution. And he tied it to being guided by some kind of cosmic or spiritual forces. So maybe it was understandable that he would want to see what Sri Aurobindo had to say. In his review, he said this, and I'll read. While remaining Indian to the core and rooting his philosophy deep in the Sanskrit classics, he, as in Sri Aurobindo now, has so clearly expounded the fundamental truths of every religion that followers of each may draw enlightenment from him and become all the more ardent worshippers of God in their particular way. I think there's quite an insight in that. His review wasn't perfect, but there is an insight in that. And I think there are two elements of this that I'd like to highlight. First, this idea that Sri Aurobindo had expounded the fundamental truths of every religion so that each follower of each individual faith can get something from this book. He's highlighting the fact that there's an expansive quality to the life divine. Sri Aurobindo is not tied to any one tradition. He doesn't stop himself to say that truth exists exclusively in one line of spiritual writing. We see, for example, that in the life divine, he uses this image of the fall, not quite frequently, but he does use it on several occasions, this idea of the fall, which is taken from Christian religion. The second idea, I think, that Sir Francis has caught hold of is this idea that it is rooted in the Sanskrit classics. Now, if Sir Francis' young husband was talking specifically about the Upanishads, then he's clearly right. I think we can even say a little bit more, not just the Upanishads, we can probably say that the genesis of the life divine started in Sri Aurobindo reflecting on the Isha Upanishad in particular. In at least the 2-year run-up before the life divine made its first feature in the Arya, before the human aspiration, which is the first chapter of the book, featured in the Arya, we know that Sri Aurobindo was drafting, reflecting upon the Isha Upanishad. There's drafts which have been published subsequently in book form. In a July 1912 entry, Sri Aurobindo says, this is in the Record of Yoga, he said the life divine commenced, but he's not talking about the book Life Divine. He appears to be talking about some kind of translation and commentary on the Isha Upanishad. Just over a year later, in November 1913, also written down in his diary, which has been published as the Record of Yoga now, he again makes reference to the life divine. He says, Isha Upanishad commentary, in brackets, the life divine, close brackets. So, The title was in his mind. The Isha Upanishad was in his mind. And it appears as if the drafts that he was working upon at the time were the foundation for a widening of his philosophical review that he wished to undertake in some way, because he moved beyond the parameters of that text. And then eventually, the widening philosophical undertaking that he engaged in became the life divine. That appears to be the broad chronology of how the life divine started. So maybe it was the case, and this is only a maybe, that Paul Richard's offer of starting a journal was just at that appropriate moment where Sri Aurobindo was considering whether to radically widen what he was engaged in already. So, having said that, let's speak a little bit about how was the life divine written.